The acrid scent of burnt cordite and cleaning solvent hung heavy in the humid air of the indoor shooting range, a familiar incense to the men who gathered there. It was a cathedral of control violence, where steel and lead sang a percussive hymn. Along the firing line, a row of figures stood in sharp contrast. On one side were the operators, a team of young, sculpted men from a special forces unit, their bodies honed into weapons and clad in the latest tactical gear. Their movements were fluid, economical, and suffused with a casual arrogance that came from being the best and knowing it. Their laughter was sharp and loud, cutting through the rhythmic crack of their custom rifles. On the other side, separated by an empty lane, stood Arthur Vance. At 87, Arthur was a relic from a different era. His frame was stooped, his hands gnarled by arthritis, his skin a roadmap of wrinkles that spoke of a long and difficult life. He wore simple, well-worn clothes, a flannel shirt and denim jeans, that looked out of place amidst the operator's modern camouflage and polymer gear. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his actions measured and free of any wasted motion. He was cleaning a vintage M1911 pistol, a weapon as old and seemingly obsolete as himself, its blued steel worn to a soft silver in places. The conflict began not with a bang, but with a sneer. Sergeant Miller, the team leader, a man whose jaw seemed permanently set in a look of condescending judgment, swaggered over to Arthur's lane. He leaned against the partition, his own state-of-the-art polymer pistol holstered on his hip, a stark contrast to the classic firearm in Arthur's hands. "Hey, Pops," Miller's voice dripped with mock respect. "You sure you should be handling that museum piece? Might fall apart on you." Arthur didn't look up. He continued to meticulously wipe down the slide of the pistol, his focus absolute. This silence, this utter lack of reaction, seemed to infuriate Miller more than any retort could have. He saw it as weakness, the passivity of an old man who knew his place. He decided to press his advantage, to make an example of the old-timer for the entertainment of his men. His eyes scanned Arthur, looking for another point of ridicule, and they settled on his forearm, exposed by a rolled-up sleeve. There, on the weathered skin, was a simple, crude tattoo. It was nothing like the intricate, artistic sleeves his own men sported. It was just a series of stark, black vertical lines, hand-poked and faded by decades of sun and time. "What's that supposed to be?" Miller laughed, pointing. "You keeping score of your bingo wins at the senior center." His team chuckled behind him, the sound echoing unnaturally in the enclosed space. Arthur paused in his work. He slowly, deliberately, placed the pistol slide on the oilcloth. He still didn't look at Miller, but his gaze seemed to turn inward, as if the mocking words were a key turning a lock on a door deep inside him. The laughter of the young soldiers became a distant buzz. The sharp smell of gunpowder faded, replaced by the scent of pine and frozen earth. The world of the shooting range dissolved around him, and he was falling backward through time, into the ghost-haunted memory of a place where the cold itself was a living enemy. The world that bloomed behind Arthur's eyes was a monochrome nightmare of white and grey. He was 20 years old again, his body not frail but wiry and tough, yet shivering uncontrollably in the brutal, sub-zero winds of the Chosin Reservoir in the winter of 1950. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that gnawed at his flesh, stole the breath from his lungs, and turned his blood to sludge. Every surface was coated in a treacherous layer of ice, and the M1 Garand he clutched felt like a block of frozen steel welded to his frostbitten hands. He was alone, huddled in a shallow foxhole scraped from the unforgiving, iron-hard ground. The rest of his company, or what was left of it, had been forced to pull back to consolidate their position, leaving him as the sole listening post on a desolate, snow-blasted ridge. His mission was simple and suicidal: hold this position, be the tripwire, and buy the others time. The night was unnervingly silent for a time, a silence stretched taut over a landscape of frozen dread. Then came the sound, a sound that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life, the faint, eerie notes of a bugle, followed by another, and then another, a chorus of brassy wails that signaled the coming of the human wave. They came not like soldiers, but like specters rising from the snow, a tide of quilted uniforms and fur hats, their faces indistinct in the pale moonlight. They chanted as they ran, a rhythmic, guttural sound that was meant to break a man's spirit before their bullets did. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to paralyze him. But something else rose to meet it, a cold, hard resolve. He was just a boy from Ohio, but in that moment, he became something else. He became an anchor. He fired until the rifle barrel glowed a dull cherry red, until the bolt cycled slower and slower in the extreme cold. He threw grenades until his arms screamed in protest. He used his entrenching tool as a weapon when they breached his position, a desperate, savage fight in the dark. When the dawn finally broke, painting the snow in grisly shades of pink and grey, he was still there. The ground around his foxhole was a frozen tableau of death. He had held. He had survived. A week later, after another impossible stand on another frozen hill, a grizzled master sergeant had found him, his eyes hollowed out by exhaustion and shock. The sergeant had taken a needle, dipped it in rifle cleaning solvent and gunpowder, and, with a steady hand, etched the first black line onto Arthur's forearm. "That's not for them," the sergeant had grunted, his voice rough with emotion. "That's for us. For the boys you saved tonight." Each line was a memorial. Not a mark for a kill, but a testament to survival against impossible odds, a symbol of a life lived in the service of saving others. It was a sacred history written on his skin, a language of sacrifice that a boy like Sergeant Miller could never hope to comprehend. Arthur's focus slowly returned to the present, the memory receding like a tide, leaving behind the cold ache of old ghosts. He looked at the faded lines on his arm, and for the first time, he met Sergeant Miller's mocking gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, only a profound and weary sadness. The tension in the shooting range had thickened to a point of near physical pressure. Miller, emboldened by his audience and Arthur's continued silence, took a step closer. He felt the thrill of dominance, the cheap power that comes from humiliating someone who cannot or will not fight back. "What's the matter, Grandpa? Cat got your tongue?" he taunted, his voice laced with venom. "Or did you just forget the story you made up for that little drawing?" The other operators, caught up in their leader's cruel charisma, continued to snicker, their expensive equipment glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. Standing a few lanes down, a man named David adjusted his hearing protection, his stomach twisting into a knot. David was in his late 30s, an Afghanistan veteran who came to the range to find a sense of peace in the familiar discipline of marksmanship. He wasn't a Tier 1 operator like Miller's team, just a former infantryman who had seen his share of real combat. He had been watching the interaction unfold with a growing sense of disgust. He recognized the type of man Sergeant Miller was, all bluster and ego, mistaking arrogance for strength. But when he looked at the old man, he saw something else entirely. He saw a stillness, a centered calm that could not be faked. It was the calm of a man who had faced true chaos and survived, a man for whom a young sergeant's taunts were less than a whisper in a hurricane. David had tried to intervene subtly a moment earlier, calling out, "Hey, leave the old-timer alone, he's just trying to shoot," only to be met with a dismissive glare from Miller. "Mind your business, civilian." One of the operators had shot back, deliberately misidentifying his veteran status. David knew he was outranked and outgunned, metaphorically speaking. These were the elites, the tip of the spear. A direct confrontation would be pointless and would likely only get him thrown out of the range. Yet, the injustice of the situation gnawed at him. The mockery of the old man's tattoo felt like a sacrilege. He didn't know its story, but he knew it was earned in a time and place these young pups could only read about in history books. His hand drifted to his phone. A desperate, long-shot idea began to form. Years ago, during a particularly rough tour, he had been helped by a command sergeant major, a man who had taken a liking to him. As a parting gift, the CSM had given him his personal number, a direct line to his office at Fort Bragg. "If you ever see something truly wrong, son, and the chain of command is broken, you call me. You call me directly," the old soldier had said. David had never used it. It felt like a sacred trust. But as he watched Miller poke a finger at Arthur's shoulder, the final line being crossed, he knew this was the moment. His fingers trembled slightly as he found the contact. The name read, CSM Wallace. He moved to a quiet corner of the range office, his heart pounding. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Wallace." David took a deep breath. "Sergeant Major, this is former Sergeant David Foster. You told me to call if I ever saw something truly wrong." He quickly and quietly explained the scene, the elite team, the public humiliation of an elderly veteran, the mockery of a tattoo that looked as old as the Korean War. He finished by describing the old man's name, which he had overheard from the range owner. "His name is Arthur Vance." There was a sudden, sharp silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, David thought the call had been dropped. Then, CSM Wallace's voice returned, but it was completely different. It was stripped of its gruffness and filled with a sense of awe and alarm. "Son, where are you right now?" David gave him the address. "Stay there," Wallace commanded. his voice now like chipped granite. "Don't let that old man leave. Help is on the way." The line went dead. David looked through the glass back at the firing line, a profound sense of dread and anticipation washing over him. He had just thrown a rock into a very deep, very still pond, and he had no idea what kind of leviathan he was about to stir up from the depths. At Fort Bragg, the sprawling nerve center of the U.S. Army Special Operations Command, the day was proceeding with its usual metronomic efficiency. In a soundproof conference room, a four-star general was presiding over a high-level briefing. This was General Thorne, a man whose reputation was forged in the fires of a dozen shadow wars. He was a figure of immense authority, his face a mask of disciplined focus as he listened to intelligence reports from across the globe. An aide entered the room, moving with a quiet urgency that immediately drew the attention of everyone present. Such an interruption was almost unheard of. The aide leaned down and whispered into the ear of Command Sergeant Major Wallace, who was seated to the general's right. Wallace's face, normally a stony mask of professionalism, went pale. He stood, excused himself, and took the call from David Foster outside the room. When he returned, he walked directly to General Thorne, leaned in, and spoke a single name. "Sir, it's about Arthur Vance." The effect of that name on General Thorne was instantaneous and startling. The mask of command shattered, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock, quickly followed by a flash of protective fury. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. The general stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. He held up a hand, silencing the intelligence officer in mid-sentence. "This briefing is over," he commanded, his voice a low growl that carried more weight than a shout. He turned to Wallace, his eyes blazing. "What's the situation?" As Wallace relayed David's report, the public humiliation, the mockery from a team of his own Special Forces operators, the general's face grew darker with every word. This was not just an act of indiscipline, it was a desecration. Arthur Vance was not just any veteran, he was a ghost, a legend, a name that was spoken only in whispers within the highest echelons of the military. He was one of the founding fathers, a pioneer of the very kind of unconventional warfare that these young operators thought they had perfected. The general began issuing orders with a speed and precision that was terrifying to behold. His voice was calm, almost unnaturally so, but it held an edge of tempered steel. "Get me a wheels-up ETA for a helicopter to the civilian range at this address. I want 2 Black Hawks, now. Scramble a security detail. 3 unmarked SUVs, fully manned. I want them moving 5 minutes ago. Get me the identity of the team leader on site. I want his service record on my tablet before we land." The entire command center, a place accustomed to responding to global crises, pivoted to focus on this single, personal mission. Aides scrambled, phones were answered, and the immense, latent power of a major military base began to coil and spring into action. Within minutes, the low, rhythmic whomp-whomp-whomp of helicopter blades began to beat the air as 2 sleek, black UH-60s lifted off from the tarmac. On the ground, a convoy of black, government-plated Chevrolet Suburbans screeched out of the motor pool, their lights flashing but sirens silent, creating a bubble of cleared traffic as they sliced through the roads leading off the base. Inside the lead vehicle sat General Thorne, his uniform immaculate, his face carved from stone. He stared out the window, his mind a tempest. The disrespect shown by his own men was a personal failure, a stain on the honor of the institution he had dedicated his life to. They had mistaken age for weakness, silence for irrelevance. They had committed the cardinal sin of the soldier. They had forgotten their own history. And he was now on his way to deliver a lesson in that history that they would never, ever forget. The convoy moved with a relentless, terrifying purpose, eating up the miles between the base and the shooting range, an instrument of judgment about to fall upon the unknowing. Back at the range, the situation had escalated. Sergeant Miller, having received no satisfaction from the silent old man, had decided to assert his authority physically. He grabbed Arthur's arm, the one with the tattoo. "All right, old man, that's enough. You're done here. Pack your junk and get out. You're a liability." The moment his fingers closed around Arthur's bicep, a change occurred. Arthur, who had been a study in passive resistance, suddenly went utterly still. A current of energy seemed to pass through his frail frame. He didn't pull away. He simply looked down at Miller's hand on his arm, and then up into Miller's eyes. For the first time, Miller saw something in those pale blue eyes that wasn't weakness. It was a cold, ancient fire, a glimpse of the abyss that this old man had stared into and survived. Miller felt a primal jolt of fear and instinctively let go, taking a half step back. It was at that precise moment that the first sound reached them. It was a faint, rhythmic thumping, a deep bass note that seemed to vibrate in their chests. It grew louder, closer, resolving into the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors beating the air. Everyone in the range, including Miller's team, looked up towards the ceiling as if they could see through it. The sound grew to a deafening roar as two massive, black helicopters swept low over the building, their rotor wash kicking up a storm of dust and leaves in the parking lot. Before anyone could process this surreal event, the squeal of tires cut through the air. A convoy of 3 black SUVs, looking like something out of a Secret Service detail, pulled aggressively into the lot, flanking the entrance. The vehicles came to a hard stop, and for a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, the doors of all 3 SUVs opened in perfect, practiced unison. A dozen soldiers in full dress uniform, not combat gear, emerged. They moved with a chilling precision, forming a cordon around the entrance to the range. They were not from a regular unit. These were honor guard, the ceremonial soldiers who guard the tomb of the unknowns, their presence a signal of the highest possible gravity. The range fell completely silent. The operators stood frozen, their mouths agape. Miller's face was a canvas of confusion and dawning horror. This was for them. For him. It made no sense. Then, the passenger door of the lead SUV opened. General Thorne emerged. He was an imposing figure, his chest a billboard of medals and ribbons that told the story of a lifetime at war. He adjusted his uniform jacket, his movements sharp and deliberate, and then began to walk towards the entrance of the building. His pace was not rushed. It was the measured, inexorable stride of a man who commanded armies, a man for whom the world slowed down and waited. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, scanned the scene inside through the glass door, and they locked onto the small, stooped figure of Arthur Vance. The general's gaze swept past Sergeant Miller and his men as if they were nothing more than furniture, irrelevant obstacles between him and his true objective. As he pushed through the door, a palpable wave of authority washed into the room, so powerful it felt like a physical force. The moment General Thorne stepped inside, the atmosphere in the shooting range transformed. The air, once filled with the casual arrogance of Miller's team, was now thick with a heavy, suffocating awe. The operators, who minutes ago were laughing and sneering, had snapped to a rigid posture of attention, their bodies reacting to the presence of a 4-star general with the instinct of trained soldiers. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with disbelief and a growing, terrifying understanding that they had made a catastrophic mistake. General Thorne's polished boots clicked rhythmically on the concrete floor as he closed the distance. He walked straight past Sergeant Miller, his eyes never leaving Arthur. He stopped precisely 1 foot in front of the old man, who stood calmly amidst the silent chaos he had inadvertently caused. For a long, breathless moment, the 2 men simply looked at each other. One was the pinnacle of the modern military, a commander of global power. The other was a forgotten relic, a ghost from a past war. But in that shared gaze, there was a profound and silent understanding, a recognition that passed between warriors across the gulf of generations. Then, in the stunned silence, General Thorne acted. His body, his movements, his entire being coalesced into a single, perfect motion. He brought his right hand up in a salute so sharp, so precise, so utterly reverent that the sound of his gloved palm striking the brim of his service cap cracked through the air like a rifle shot. It was not the perfunctory salute given to a subordinate. It was the salute of a soldier to a king, of a student to a master, of a man in the presence of living history. Mr. Vance, the general's voice boomed, resonating with a power that seemed to shake the very walls of the building. It is an honor, sir. An absolute honor. Arthur simply nodded, a flicker of acknowledgement in his ancient eyes. The general held the salute for a full 3 seconds before dropping his hand. He then turned, very slowly, to face the petrified group of Special Forces operators. His face was no longer that of a respectful soldier. It was the face of a wrathful god. He let his gaze drift over each one of them before it settled, with crushing weight, on Sergeant Miller. "I am General Thorne," he began, his voice deceptively calm. "I am the commander of the United States Army Special Operations Command, which means, Sergeant Miller, that I am your commanding officer. And right now, I am so profoundly disgusted that I can barely stand to look at you." He took a step towards them, and they seemed to shrink before him. "You men," he gestured with a contemptuous flick of his wrist, "you think you're the tip of the spear. You think that because you can shoot straight and run fast and wear this expensive gear, you are the apex of what it means to be a warrior. You walk around with an arrogance that you have not earned, looking down on the very men who built the road you now walk upon. He pointed a rigid finger at Arthur Vance. You see this man. You see this quiet, unassuming, elderly man. Your vocabulary is too small, your imagination too stunted, to comprehend what he is. He is a living monument. He is a founding member of the organization that would one day become Delta Force. He wrote the book on unconventional warfare before you were even a thought in your father's mind. The general then strode over to Arthur and gently took his arm, turning it so the faded tattoo was visible to all. And this bingo score you were mocking. His voice dripped with scorn. This is a legend. General Thorne's gaze hardened as he turned his full, undivided attention onto Sergeant Miller. The booming, declamatory voice he had used to address the room vanished, replaced by a low, menacing whisper that was infinitely more terrifying. It was the quiet voice of absolute power, the tone a man uses when he is about to dismantle another man's entire world. You, Sergeant, he began, his eyes boring into Miller's, have the privilege of wearing the uniform of a United States Army soldier. You have been entrusted with a position of leadership, and you use that privilege to mock a man to whom you are not worthy of carrying water. You have failed as a leader, you have failed as a soldier, and you have failed as a man. Miller's face, which had been pale with shock, began to crumble. The arrogant smirk was long gone, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure terror. He tried to speak, to stammer out an apology, but the general cut him off with a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Do not speak, Thorne hissed. You will listen. He held up Arthur's arm again, his touch gentle and reverent. You called this a legendary kill count. You were right about the legendary part. You were catastrophically, insultingly wrong about the rest. You see these lines. This isn't a trophy for taking lives. This is a testament to saving them. This is the Chosin Cross, a field-expedient medal of honor given to one man, and one man only. Each of these lines represents one night during the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir when this man, Corporal Arthur Vance, single-handedly held his position against an entire battalion of enemy soldiers. Not once. Not twice. 5 times. The general's voice grew thick with emotion, the story taking on a life of its own. 5 times, he was left as the rear guard, the sacrificial lamb, and 5 times he refused to die. He held back human waves with nothing but a rifle, a few grenades, and a core of pure, unadulterated American grit. The kill count you so ignorantly joked about isn't the number of enemies he killed. It's the number of his own men he saved. Military historians estimate that because of his actions on those 5 nights, over 200 American soldiers made it off that frozen hellscape alive. 200 sons, fathers, and husbands went home because this one man refused to break. He finally released Arthur's arm and took a step towards Miller, invading his personal space. Miller flinched as if struck. You wear the green beret, the general whispered, his voice dripping with acid. You are supposed to be a quiet professional. But you are loud, you are arrogant, and you are ignorant. You have dishonored yourself, you have dishonored your team, and you have dishonored the sacred memory of the men who came before you. You are a disgrace to the uniform I, and Mr. Vance, have dedicated our lives to. The general paused, letting the weight of his words crush the young sergeant. Your career as a Special Forces operator is over. As of this moment, you are relieved of your command. You will surrender your weapon and your credentials to my aid. You and your entire team are confined to barracks until further notice. Is that understood? Miller could only nod, tears of shame and terror welling in his eyes. He had been verbally and professionally eviscerated, his entire identity shattered in less than 5 minutes by a living legend he hadn't even recognized. The air in the range was thick with the wreckage of Sergeant Miller's career. General Thorne stood like an executioner, his judgment delivered, his gaze cold and final. He was about to give the order to have Miller and his team formally escorted from the premises in disgrace, a public shaming that would follow them for the rest of their military lives. The machinery of institutional punishment was grinding into motion. But before the general could speak the final, damning words, a soft, raspy voice cut through the silence. General. All eyes turned to Arthur Vance. He had been a silent witness to the entire exchange, his expression unreadable. Now, he took a slow, deliberate step forward. He reached out with a gnarled hand and placed it gently on General Thorne's uniformed forearm. The gesture was simple, yet it carried an immense weight. It was the calming touch of an elder, a quiet request for restraint. "Thorn," Arthur said, using the general's last name with a familiarity that stunned everyone present. "Let it be." The general looked down at the old man, his expression of fury softening into one of confusion and deep respect. "Sir, they dishonoured you. They dishonoured everything we stand for. It cannot go unanswered." Arthur shook his head slowly, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "They are children, Thorn. They're just children, playing with dangerous toys. They're full of pride and fire. We were the same once, remember." He turned his gaze from the general to the broken form of Sergeant Miller. His eyes, which had held the cold fire of ancient battles, now held only a deep and sorrowful compassion. He saw not an enemy, but a young man who had lost his way. "Breaking him won't teach him anything," Arthur's voice rumbled softly. "It will only make him bitter. Humiliation is a poor teacher. It breeds resentment, not wisdom." He walked slowly towards Miller, who flinched, expecting another blow, verbal or otherwise. Instead, Arthur stopped in front of him and looked him directly in the eye. "Son," he said, his voice kind, "your strength is not in this." He gently tapped the rifle slung across Miller's chest. "And it's not in the rank on your collar. True strength, the kind that lasts, it's in here." He tapped his own chest. "It's in the humility to know that you don't have all the answers. It's in the wisdom to see the value in those who have come before you. The greatest weapon a soldier ever has is respect. Respect for your enemy, respect for your brothers, and respect for your history. You lost that today. Find it again." The unexpected grace, the sheer, unadulterated mercy of the moment, was a more powerful blow to Miller than any of the general's threats. It shattered the last of his defenses, and tears began to stream freely down his face. Arthur simply patted his shoulder gently, a gesture of forgiveness and encouragement, before turning and walking back to his lane. The lesson had been given, not with anger, but with a quiet, profound wisdom that left everyone in the room utterly speechless. General Thorn stood for a long moment, deeply moved and chastened by Arthur's wisdom. The old man was right. The goal was not to destroy a soldier, but to build a better one. He looked at the weeping Sergeant Miller and his humble team, and his plan for their future shifted. Vengeance gave way to education. He turned to his aide. "Revoke my last order," he commanded, his voice firm but now lacking its earlier fury. "Sergeant Miller and his team are not confined to barracks. They have a new assignment, effective immediately." He let that hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "They are to report to the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center at 0600 tomorrow. They will spend the next 6 months on detached duty. They will not be carrying weapons. They will be emptying bedpans, feeding the infirm, and listening to the stories of the wounded and elderly veterans in the long-term care wing. Their mission is to learn the meaning of sacrifice and humility from the men they were so quick to judge today. They will report directly to the head nurse of the geriatric ward." Dismissed. The punishment was, in its own way, far more profound than a court-martial. It was a sentence of forced empathy. Without another word, the general turned and walked with Arthur out of the range, leaving the stunned and shamed operators in the care of his aides. The following months were transformative for Miller. The first few weeks were a living hell of pride-swallowing tasks. But slowly, surrounded by the quiet dignity of men who had lost limbs, who battled with invisible wounds, and who faced the end of their lives with grace, his own arrogance began to erode. He learned to listen. He heard stories of Iwo Jima, of the Tet Offensive, of Fallujah. He saw real strength, not in sculpted muscles, but in the stubborn will of a 90-year-old Marine trying to feed himself despite his shaking hands. One afternoon, 3 months into his assignment, he saw Arthur Vance visiting a friend in the ward. His heart pounding with a mixture of fear and shame, Miller knew what he had to do. He waited until Arthur was sitting alone in a quiet solarium, looking out over the gardens. He approached slowly, his posture no longer the arrogant swagger of an operator, but the hesitant, humble stance of a penitent. "Mr. Vance," he said quietly. Arthur turned, his expression calm and welcoming. Miller stood before him, his head bowed. "Sir, I wanted to apologize. What I did at the range, it was inexcusable. I was arrogant, and I was ignorant. These last few months, working here, I've started to understand what you tried to tell me. I've met the men who built the road. I wanted to say I'm sorry, truly sorry." Arthur looked at the young man for a long time, seeing the genuine change in his eyes. He reached out and gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Sit down, son," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and tell me what you've learned." Miller sat, and as the afternoon sun streamed through the window, he began to talk, and for the first time in his life, he felt the profound relief of redemption. In the quiet epilogue of their encounter, life found a new, more thoughtful rhythm. Arthur Vance could still be found at the shooting range on occasion, his vintage pistol gleaming under the lights. But now, he was rarely alone. He had become a quiet mentor to a new generation of shooters, young men and women who sought not just his technical skill, but his profound calm. He would guide a young soldier's hand, not just showing them how to aim, but teaching them to control their breathing, to find their center, to understand that the true target is not the paper-down range, but the mastery of oneself. His lesson to Sergeant Miller had rippled outwards, a quiet reminder that the loudest voice in the room is often the weakest. The story became a quiet legend in its own right, a morality tale whispered in barracks and briefing rooms, a testament to a different kind of strength. The world is full of quiet heroes like Arthur Vance. They are not on posters or in headlines. They are the elderly man in the grocery store, the quiet woman at the library, the neighbor you've never spoken to. They walk among us, carrying the invisible weight of history in the stoop of their shoulders and the depths of their eyes. Their medals are tucked away in dusty boxes, their stories hidden behind a wall of humility. They wear their past not as a badge of honor to be flaunted, but as a quiet part of their soul, sometimes visible only in a faded tattoo, a slight limp, or a far-off look that recalls a world we can only imagine. They ask for nothing. They seek no validation. They are the living pillars of our society, the guardians of a history we are in constant danger of forgetting. If you are moved by Arthur's story of quiet dignity and unexpected grace, if you believe that the measure of a nation is how it honors its defenders, then let this be more than just a passing video. Let it be a call to action. Take the time to listen. Ask the elderly veteran in your family or your community about their life. Look past the wrinkles and the slow pace and see the warrior within. If you believe in honoring the sacrifices of those who came before, share this story. Let it serve as a powerful reminder that true legends don't always shout their names. Sometimes, they wait patiently for us to be quiet enough to hear their silence.